Hello and a warm welcome to the latest edition of the CGMA Management Accounting Series in partnership with CNBC Africa. I'm Gugulethu Cele. Now, we know that value creation, value preservation, and value reporting has become critical to many organizations within the current business landscape. But how do we measure it? How do we ensure that this value speaks to all stakeholders relative to the businesses? And most importantly, how do we ensure that we preserve this value in order to see sustainable outcomes? Well, these are some of the elements that we'll continue to discuss in today's panel discussion, and more insight and analysis can certainly be found in the latest report with regard to how this impacts on business models and business strategies within the South African and African context. However, before we do begin, I would like to acknowledge the presence, though, of Mr. Badibanga Promes. He is FCMA, CGMA Regional Vice President of the Association of the International Certified Professional Accountants, as well as other CGMA representatives that we have in the room. Of course, they will be participating with us in a panel discussion. But for that panel and to set the tone for the conversation today, I'm joined by my esteemed guests, all gentlemen. So I'm the female who might stir the pot slightly today. Closest to my right is Adrian van der Merwe, Partner for Financial Services Africa at Ernst & Young, South Africa, followed by Monashe Mopa, who's the Managing Director of Naftali Consulting and Research Institute. Dumelo Chake, Executive Director at Senate Capital, also joins us on the panel today. Now, we will be unpacking this over the next hour and, of course, engaging with our audience members to really get perspective from across the prism with regard to what value creation is and, most importantly, preserving this value. But let's start with you three gentlemen, given the various backgrounds that you have and, of course, the stakeholders that you need to speak to. How do you, Adrian, as we make our way down the panel, create value, not only for the company and entity that you serve, but of course ensuring that that value that you create is sustainable in this particular essence? So essentially, your definition of value in this current day.
It's a very good question, because one of the things that I'm finding about value these days is that with the technology is a key subject for me. And I'm finding that value these days is being challenged in terms of, is it about creation or is it about preservation? And depending on the size, depending on the perspective or the perception that people have on value, is that in new entities or in entrepreneurial view, value is challenging the incumbents.
And this speaks very closely to your background, because for many of you who might not be aware, Adrian is actually an entrepreneur by background, yes, but later then sold your entity to EY.
Yes, that's correct. And I think that's and that's where the value is for the corporates as well, is actually identifying opportunities like that too. So from a corporate perspective, value preservation seems to be very topical at the moment, because you're effectively protecting your business model. Whereas at the same time, with the Industrial Revolution, fourth Industrial Revolution being what it is that at the same time they need to innovate, which is the value creation. So it's challenging, because they have to challenge their own business models. Mm-hmm. And the entrepreneurs are coming in saying, well, we have no background, we have no business model. We can start with a fresh view of the world and challenging the corporate environment. So it makes for an interesting discussion.
Makes for an interesting discussion. Now, from your perspective, Monashe, how do you determine and establish value from your perspective?
To me, Gugu, thank you so much. Value, if we can look at it, we've got an economy, and to answer all the deficiencies which are in economy, we need to create value. And we've got three major players within an economy, and that is public policy, we've got business, and we've got the community, which actually serves as your customers, and that's where you get other partners. So basically, if we can look at the aspect of value creation for an entity, we're looking at how they service all these stakeholders and how they keep those stakeholders happy. So basically, each entity has got a different business model. And by having a different business model, my entity and Adrian's entity, right, might have different ways of doing business. But at the end of the day, what we are saying is, what is it that you have given your stakeholders and what is it that they remain with, which makes your business unique, which makes your business different from the others. And at the end of the day, that's what makes both the customers come back, and that's what makes the shareholders happy, and that's what makes the government satisfied. So we're looking at all these stakeholders which need to be serviced by one entity. So how does that entity create value? Which makes it a very exciting topic to discuss.
We'll come back to some of the elements that you highlighted, certainly about how different stakeholders view what value creation is, because that certainly does influence business strategies quite evidently so. But Dumelo, you're the money man, right? Mr. Capital, providing opportunities for entrepreneurs, and essentially, you spend investors' money. I would think that you would put a number to value.
Absolutely, absolutely. For us, it's as you said, it's a numbers game. It's how we able to show to our investors the value of their money, how much you're putting into our business and how much we're giving out. So I think in our space, it's more of a black and white game, but we're trying to muddy the waters a bit and say, is there some gray areas? Can we actually create value, but also do good? But because mostly in our space, people look for the numbers game. I invest X amount for this much return. But we're now trying to say, you can give so much money, but also do good in this sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'd like us to expand on that just a little bit further and really get a sense of how it's actually impacted on your operations. We're all quite familiar with the macroeconomic climate in South Africa, where there's depressed economic growth, where we are seeing a slight pickup, though, in confidence levels from business, but of course, many hanging parts with regard to political uncertainty and, of course, ratings agencies certainly putting South Africa on tenterhooks. That places a lot of pressure on you because, number one, identifying a value proposition within an investment opportunity becomes a little bit more difficult. And of course, the waiting game might need to be lengthened out, given that you might not see returns as and when you expect it to. However, you just might need to be a little bit more patient with your capital. Is that the case?
I think it's even beyond that. It's now people saying, is it worth giving you my money in the current climate environment, one? And two, is the level of confidence politically and economically in the country. 5 years ago, it was easier for, or even 10 years ago, it was easier for you to bring someone into the country and invest. 10 years later, it's a bit complex for someone to come in and invest. And you would think that with the rand exchange rate, people will be willing to come and invest more, but it's becoming a very, very complex game. I remember 10 years ago, I used to work for a company that used to invest money. And for us, it was easy to go to the US and bring money here. 10 years later, it's complex for someone to actually say, you know what, Google, here's a big opportunity, let's invest. Mm-hmm. People are more concerned about the political changes that are going to happen in the country, and that becomes a complex situation.
Mm-hmm. I'd like us to pick up on this as well with your fellow panelists, because it goes back to what you had alluded to, Munashe, that as a business, essentially, you're serving multiple stakeholders. At some point in time, though, maybe one particular stakeholder takes a certain preference versus others. I'm not too sure if that is the case or an element that might be shared in the room. But is that the case that we're finding, given your operations as well, in the current climate in South Africa, where, again, confidence is low, and as Dumelo alluded to, essentially, there's not much optimism. But can we change things around in order for this to have a positive impact on business strategies that we look to implement in the future?
Okay, thank you for that. Basically, I always say we are sharing equitably what the business is making. So at the end of the day, when we are saying equitable, we are not saying equal, right? So there's a difference there. There is a stakeholder who has to get more. If I start a business, I expect to get more than what my employees would get. So it needs to be clear that it should be equitable, but it being equitable, it still has to satisfy each and every party. But it's a very difficult, we're actually walking on thin ice there, because employees are demanding something, the shareholders are demanding something which is particularly different from what others might be demanding. So we need to be careful as to, the directors of any company need to be very careful as to how they equitably distribute whatever the share of the cake that's there.
And isn't that definition of the cake exactly what needs to seemingly change? Because essentially that seems as though that is what our value proposition and offering is. But I also know that human development is something that sits very close to you.
It's
How
part
do
of
you
the
then?
cake. It's part of the cake. You know, as consultants, you know, we look into all variables. We look at the social aspect, we look at the economic aspect, we also look at how a business services the government as well, as it is a stakeholder. So basically, though it's a bit tricky, but we need to be very careful as to how we share that cake, which also includes the social impact. So the cake is including the social impact.
Many particular aspects that you brought in there, the social impact, and I guess all of this does speak to a sense of shared value for various stakeholders, despite the share investor obviously perhaps being one of the more prominent stakeholders within this piece of the pie. I want to come back to you here, Adrian, to get your sense, given that you alluded to technology, the fourth industrial revolution, and adding more value. Sometimes these terms and even some of these themes might appear to be they leave us flustered and maybe looking for words and trying to really identify how do we actually innovate and create value? How do we use technology and create value? Are these principles that you've implemented not only within your entrepreneurial experience, but also within the corporate culture of EY that you work in?
Very much so. One of our biggest drives at EY at the moment is effectively going digital. And we don't...
But let's be honest, that scares us, right? How many of you are actually scared of digitalization here in the room? That maybe your job might be under threat, that maybe, I'd be happy you don't need to draw the curtains anymore at home. You just, use some kind of technology tool. But by show of hands, any of you nervous or taken aback by the threat of digitalization? You can raise them higher, slightly. I see some yeses and some nos. Perfect. But let's expand on that, because as a corporate entity, if that's where you're headed, you need to convince the people in the audience and many more out there in business that this is actually the right way to go.
Well, and this is the challenge for corporates really, is because the value preservation for them how many exercises have we been through where it's what do we call it, cost cutting? Or cost optimization. I love that term, cost optimization exercise. Now, that's where technology is really coming in around actually developing efficiencies in organizations. When I started in consulting, we talked about a paperless environment. That was 17 years ago. We're still not quite there yet. But that's a simple example of where digital is going. But it's actually, that's a very simplistic example. There's a lot more that it's going to do. And yes, it is going to challenge the traditional business models. And everybody's aware of that. And I think that the challenge for all of us is that we're going to all need to be able to relearn. Because digital is actually going to change how our businesses do business and how we actually do our jobs. And that means we're not going to be learning to do a different job. We're going to be learning some different skills that apply to our job now. So, for example, my favorite joke, and I told Dr. Sarah about that, was, as accountants, the whole concept of Control-C, Control-V. We do that often in a day, and you spend a lot of time doing Control-C, Control-V. Now, for somebody who's spent a lot of time studying, that doesn't add value. And I think taking the knowledge that you've gone and acquired and actually being able to apply it in your job is value creation. And that's where something like digital is going to, and it's not just digital, there's a whole raft of technology changes coming that's going to change how people interact and how the traditional business models run. And that's going to change how we create and preserve value for our own organizations as individuals. Because that's the key question we have to ask ourselves. Where's the value that I add to my organization? And how can I improve the value I add to my organization?
A twofold question there. You mentioned that it starts with us as individuals as to how do I add more value. how do we instill this kind of thinking when essentially I'm employed to perform a certain job, I'm employed to perform certain objectives, that's essentially what I need to do, versus someone who might be a little bit more disruptive in their thinking and traditionally maybe in the entrepreneurial space?
It's a good question because what it's all very well for me to say that we've got to challenge how we add value, but not everybody, like you say, not everybody will be thinking like that. And in some cases, that's where the corporates have responsibilities to their people to actually take them on that journey too, take us on that journey, where we're actually saying to our staff, to our clients, if you're going that route and you're investing in creating value, challenging the traditional business model, then you've got to take your staff, you've got to take and all your stakeholders along with you on that journey. And that in itself is a process. And you've got to have the vision to do that as well. So it's going to be a challenging change for everyone. But I think the key thing is that if you have the right leadership and the right processes in place, it'll be something that it'll be a journey that the corporates can go on and actually take people with them on that journey. And so the responsibility will come down from, I think, at a boardroom level. It'll be determined there.
From a boardroom level, but it does need to shift down. Dumela, I want to take advantage and come to you and actually speak to how do you do this in the practical sense, because it sounds like exactly what you've alluded to earlier.
Well, firstly, I just want to challenge what Adrian is saying from a banking perspective. The big four banks have high-tech techno that they're currently running with. Rian Starson came in with Capitec and ran probably a baseline model where it's literally a room like this, few chairs, 5 computers, and when you come to apply for a loan, you just plug in the stuff in that computer. It goes to a central place in Cape Town. Your loan is either declined or accepted. He's killed out the whole back-end issues of techno that big banks have. That's why then he could afford to have a low base cost. You could pay, you could really have a cost-to-income ratio that's better than most banks. And from 2002 up to now, the Capitec share price has gone up 50,000% times. Normal banks, without any techno that we're busy talking about. That's one. 2, how do you accommodate the tuck shop owner in the location to say, let's move digital? That's for me where I'm trying to find out. We're looking for value in this digital world, but the biggest market for me is the tuck shop market. You take Soweto, 3 million people. How many tuck shops exist there? And how would you move that into a techno space?
I think and I love the Capitec example because I think what they got right, and this is my personal perception, is their focus on the customer. At the end of the day, they focused on what the customer needed, and that's what they delivered. They don't have a complex product set. It's a very simple, it's a very focused product set, and they're focused on what the customer required. And I think from a value perspective, that focus underpins their success. And and then having an efficient operation in the background. I agree. Technology from their side, they might be embarking on that journey now, but they didn't need to. They've gotten this far so successfully, and they're now investing in that. But fundamentally, their business model is focused on the customer, and that's why I think they've done so well.
Well, for me, I think the one thing that Capitec has done well is just bring about convenience and cost saving. And regardless where you are in the value chain of income, you want to save money. Therefore, I've seen most of my peers, private bank clients, but always have a Capitec account somewhere lined up. That's one. 2, the convenience of their Global One account. We travel globally. You get you definitely don't have to call anybody from that you're leaving the country. In the big 4 banks, you have to call a banker, inform them, and the chances that there'll probably be 1 out of 4 that they won't even correctly align your card to the country that you go into. Capitec, regardless where you go, you get onto a plane, tell nobody, and your card works there. So for me, they have found a way to kind of capture the base of the pyramid model, and also slowly now creeping into the high net worth individual. Because regardless where you are in the world, the costs are the same, regardless which ATM you use. Therefore, they found a way to create value for a more bigger audience and still increase themselves. That's why the share price is growing so much, and them and Naspers are the two JSE listed companies that are growing in a very high rate.
And of course, again, focused on technology there, and you mentioned the financial services institutions that are there too. But I also want us to come back to us as audience members here who might work within management accounting roles, who might work within the construction space or various other sectors within South Africa society, as to how do we translate some of those particular lessons, positive lessons learned from the institutions that you've mentioned, and implement that into our strategies and business, not only value preservation, but value reporting as well when it comes to the organizations that we represent. Because some might say financial services would be very different to other sectors. So there are nuances that appear to be very different. And of course, the individual and people's skills. Sometimes banking might be easier because it deals with relationships. If I'm moving goods from Durban Harbour to Johannesburg, very little people interaction that takes place there. So are there seamless lessons that can be literally Control V, Control C, into another sector and industry that we see?
Well, when we're looking at the aspect of reporting, we have the integrated report, which can be applied in any entity, be it small, big entity, whatever the size. For instance, I have a client in Limpopo, a very small client, right, who's doing manufacturing engineering. So basically, most of these small entities in manufacturing engineering want to apply for funding, right, with DTI and these other government and agencies. So basically what we do is we create an integrated report for them, right? And within the integrated report, you would find out that there is one person who owns that entity and he's sponsoring a small team or has started a small soccer team. That's a social impact there. And as you need to report all aspects from all stakeholders, right, you need to include all that in the integrated report. So I personally think it's easy to report how you are making value in any entity.
How do we do that in the practical sense? Because when I think of this integrated report, I think of a prism where there's a white light that shines in on the one end, and then this multitude of rainbow colors that appears on the other end, which is how the definition of value will be interpreted by the various stakeholders. Because if I'm coming to Tumelo and I say, I need you to invest in my entity, he's looking at my numbers, he's looking at my balance sheet, is this a viable business model? I come to you, you looking at value creation as to how am I empowering the community that I'm serving. I come back to Adrian, and Adrian might be looking at other aspects with regard to technology. Why am I not innovating efficiently? Instead, I'm still sticking to the basics. So how do we do that, essentially, where this one definition of value can be interpreted by the multitude of investors and stakeholders, that might interpret value differently? And is that actually the challenge that we have within the current business landscape in South Africa, given the volatility and environment that we're in? Adrian?
So this goes back to a point Tumelo made a lot earlier about investing in South Africa. I think from a value reporting perspective, one of the challenges we have, you talked about the white light going on one side and coming out rainbow on the other, is the governance around the prism. Because it's a trust issue at the end of the day. And if you trust that the governance in the entity is there, then what you get out in terms of the integrated report and that then it becomes readable value. You can take what you want from the report and see, well, this is the value that I want from the organization. I can identify it. It's tangible. It's reported. Happy with that. But fundamentally, do I trust what's being reported?
How do you determine trust?
It's a good question. And in the business environment, and it's for me it's the corporate government, and in the entrepreneurial environment, it's the bank account story, If you are an entrepreneur and you're running your business and your own personal expenses out of the same bank account, that's not good corporate governance. So it has different applications at different, depending on the size of the organization. And obviously the larger corporates, the corporate governance is a lot better. But we've also seen failures in corporate governance. So at the end of the day, you still have to take an element of risk, and that's where price comes in. So that there's always a trade-off. But from the integrated reporting perspective, I think corporate governance is a key thing for what we need in South Africa to establish that trust, because it makes it a lot easier for people to identify the value and therefore invest or not, as they see fit.
Dumelo, I'm expecting you to jump in here and see if you disagree.
No, now I'm just going to add on to something. I think it's more of a level of accountability. If we're able to, trust comes from us being accountable to each other. And if that level is higher, if I read a report from Adrian that I can trust, and because I can hold him accountable, then that becomes a much more useful and relevant reporting for me. That's one. Two, I've always said value is in the eye of the beholder. Depending on what I'm looking for, that becomes value. So you can really try to accommodate the whole stakeholder, what I'm looking for. If I had to open this book, all I want to know is the numbers, the P ratios, gross profit margins, net profit, and the other nitty-gritties about social impact. Yes, I do care about it, but it will not make me make a better decision for what I'm doing for my clients. So it's really more of, can you try to accommodate everyone else, but also those that read, they know what they're looking for.
So if you're going in and you understand the value that you're trying to identify, you'll go in there with clarity as to what it is that you're looking for, even if it is the compounded annual growth rate.
Absolutely.
Well, we're going to take a quick ad break. When we do return, though, we will engage with our audience members to get their perspective on value creation, value preservation, and value reporting, and, of course, dissect this topic further with our esteemed panelists. We'll be back with more right after this. Welcome back. You're still watching the CGMA CNBC Africa Management Accounting Series, taking a look at value creation, preservation, and reporting. Just before the ad break with my panelists, we certainly delved into the issue of what the definition of value is and how it's interpreted by various stakeholders, but also ensuring that various stakeholders, when there's trust involved with the institution that they're dealing with, are able to easily identify what value creation is to them. Well, we're going to continue with this particular focus in just a moment, but we also have our audience members who have joined us for a question and answer session, and we do have 3 questions that we'll commence taking, get responses from our panelists, and then continue with the second round of questions. We'll start with you, sir, if you could kindly introduce yourself and fire away.
Good afternoon, all. Thank you for this time to ask my question or to make my contribution. My name is Ngukuko Nyati. I'm a management accountant. My contribution in regards to the customer. I believe no matter how well you create value for the investor, if you don't have value, in fact, relevant value at that moment with the customer or to the customer, you don't have a sustainable case in the future. Because if your customers find an alternative, they can move instantly. Yeah. So I believe value is always relative with time. It has to be relevant, and it has to be to the customer. If you are relevant to the customer, you're creating value to the customer, your future is guaranteed. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your opinion there, Ngukuko. Much appreciated. We'll move the mic on to you, sir, to get your question, and then we'll come back to you, sir, for the third question. You can go ahead.
The name's Dennis McCarthy, independent consultant. Don't the panel think that this debate about what value is due to a change in the purpose of business from purely producing returns to investors to creating a wider value for the whole of society, which obviously includes the investors themselves? And society taking a much greater interest and a much more active role in what the different outputs of a business are.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your question there, Dennis. We'll come to you, sir. If you could go ahead and with your question. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Sipo. Okay, the first question to Adrian. Why do corporate rely more on external consultant? I'm not picking on you, to quantify the value.
Yeah.
Okay, on Tumelo's side, in South Africa, it seems as if, the technology is more of the high-end customer. But I see, your example of tuck shop, there's more value that the tuck shop can be, the tuck shop owner can benefit out of technology. Why in South Africa is that perception that when the company create technology, it's being marketed as for high-end customer, not for the low-end customers?
Perfect. Thank you so much for your question there, Sipho. I'd like us to start off with the first opinion that we had from Nguquko, giving us insight into value creation for the customer, who obviously in time, once they are not happy, as they say, customers move and talk literally with their feet. So essentially the value creation not being made there. Anyone keen to respond to that particular aspect, where the customer apparently, or rather seemingly, seems to be taking more focus?
I completely agree, by the way, I concur. And I think one of the value creation, not challenges, opportunities that's happening at the moment is effectively the startups. Because, and as much as it frustrates me, everybody talks about Airbnb and Uber. Those are prime examples of organizations that have started that are customer-centric. And we often consult with clients around getting that customer centricity back. Because what effectively happens with organizations, especially organizations that have been around for many years, is that they've lost sight of the customer. And that's where the startups come in, the entrepreneurs come in, like Capitec, and say, let's put the customer back as our number one focus and deliver a product to them. And they do very well as organizations, that customer centricity. So I completely concur with you, your statement.
If I may say something, I do not completely agree with the statement. I'll tell you why. ArcelorMittal, for instance, came up with a different model, or from a different perspective, that the employee is their number one stakeholder. Now, you think that maybe they are bluffing, but I'll tell you that it is actually a good approach, because the employee is the one that would have a focus towards your customer and every other stakeholder for that matter. So there is need to strike a balance of, when we're focusing on all these stakeholders. Because if we only concentrate on the customer, then you'll have a high attrition rate from the employee side, because you're only servicing the customer. So we need to have a balance that the customer are satisfied, and that's the role of the integrated report.
Yeah.
It has to expose all that we have a focus on the customer, we have a focus on the employees, we have a focus on the investors, and we have a focus on the community at large.
And that really does speak to Dennis's question with regard to the changing model of value creation and actually understanding what value is, moving away perhaps from the heightened focus on investors to society at large, because we're all very conscious now as to what kind of value am I getting as a stakeholder. Dumelo, if we could tie that in.
I'm going to turn Manash's model upside down and use Jack Ma's model. He says the customer first, employee second, shareholder last. Because without your customer, your business won't run. And your customer makes sure that you pay your employees. And your employees servicing your customer make sure that shareholders get value. So for me, it's customer first. And going back to my example, that's what Capitec did. Capitec just cut out the mushmash of conventional banking and gave the customer what they needed. Instead of giving you a bouquet of products that you don't need, they know that three things happen in any given time in a customer. You transact, you save, and you borrow. The other stuff are just a nice to have. And once they got that right, customers moved. And fourthly, they knew that customers price sensitive. So they make you part of the conversation of creating the costing model for them. So you know exactly how much you're charged every month. How many of you guys have opened up a bank statement, and on the debit side, you don't even know why those things are there. Capitec gives you a much more focused structure, which is client focused. So for me, it's customer is always number one. I don't know if they are always right, but they're definitely always number one.
Always number one. I want to tie that and challenge you on what we heard from Sipho. Sipho's question with regard to the element of trying to create value within the tuck shop or informal retail environment within South Africa. And perhaps if we can allude to how technology and innovation needs to be implemented there. And of course, tying back to some of the elements that you alluded to with regard to value creation for the customer, employee, as well as the investors, which essentially in a tuck shop environment might just be one person.
Well, in my view, I think, and this maybe might reveal my next move, I think the next move for big corporates like Tiger Brands and most of the FMCG is to partner with tuck shops. And also then, in that case, move to what Adrian wants to do is, how do you capacitate them with technology for them to be able to operate better? How do you, from one thing is, how do they manage stock management? How do they manage cash flow management? And how do you link yourself with a Tiger Brands to have flour and all the products which they have for them to be linked with a tuck shop? Because for you in Soweto, for people not to move from Soweto to go into Joburg to buy products, it's how then do you bring the products to Soweto, to a tuck shop mode, where people then can move in that sense. But moreover, how do you link with government social grants? To link that with government, where people that get grants on a monthly basis don't have to move from there, which is costly as well. But then they've got tuck shop network modes within the townships to create value. So that for me is maybe where we should be looking at, is how do we capacitate those tuck shops with techno to move forward.
There's several elements that I want us to build up on that in just a moment with regard to human capability and, of course, upskilling the labor force itself and, of course, the role of management accountants within those corporates to reach out to entrepreneurs as well as other individuals who might be have the scale but not necessarily have the capability. I do want us to follow up on Sipho's second question, which was probably aimed at both you, Adrian, and Munashe. Corporates using consultants?
That's a... Look, there's a few elements to that question. One of them is that often it's what do you see elsewhere? That's often a question we get from clients. What is everybody else doing? And what is your experience elsewhere? We want to embark on this journey, but we're petrified of the risk. It's going to take significant investment. It's going to take a certain amount of time. It's going to take a certain level of staff time and investment. We want to ensure that it's as successful as possible. What have you seen elsewhere and what have you done elsewhere? So it's access to that IP from the organization that you get not just locally and globally that adds value. The second part of it, and sorry, that's a very consulting answer, but that's... Please buy. And so that's one element of it. But the second element of it as well is the fact that a lot of clients, a lot of the people we engage with, our clients, are actually working very hard. Nobody has got the time to then go and actually be innovative within the organization. Unless somebody in the organization comes to you and says to you, this is your job now, focus on it. They don't have the time and the capacity to actually go and be innovative in their roles as well. So that's where effectively you're a flexible IP-driven workforce for your clients. And that's the opportunity. But having said that, the risk in any change management or in any innovation or projects for clients is that at the end of the day, clients have to go on the journey with us. So it's, otherwise you leave the building and it's not successful. But that's typically why.
Okay, adding to that, you see, it's partly part of human nature to say, for every major decision, you have to consult with somebody who will give you an independent perspective or an independent view. So basically, we are there to give an independent view towards major decisions to several organizations. Despite that, we also look at other variables that an insider will not look at. We research more because at the end of the day, that organization is our client. So we cannot bank on giving them things that they know. So we will major on looking at variables that they cannot look at. We will research deeper. We will go all out to even buy other views from other people, you understand? So that at the end of the day, we have a product that they would say, we didn't see it this way. You understand? That's the model of our business. So at the end of the day, businesses need us.
Indeed, and the various viewpoints are quite critical in order to ensure that there is sustainability there. So you've always proven to be quite a strong wingman, I can tell, making sure that your guys get the girls anyway. I'd like to come to the floor for a second round of questions, if there are any, before we start getting some insight from our panelists as to how we translate this into the operations, the thinking, and of course how management accountants have to implement their roles within the institutions that they lead. Second round of questions. Anyone else with a question for the panelists or would like to raise a point of relevance that they'd like to bring forward? We've got two questions. We'll start with you, sir, and then come to you at the back there, sir. If you could please stand up and introduce yourself and go ahead with your question.
Good afternoon. My name's John Roberts. This is a little off the point and really about long-term sustaining and value. But with all the new technologies that we've got, where are the skills coming from to sustain them? From what I can understand, we're still teaching all of our kids what we should have taught them 50 years ago. Our business schools, most of them, are not teaching new stuff, they're teaching old stuff. How do we move from the jobs which are going to be destroyed into the jobs which are going to be created?
Fantastic question, John. Thank you so much for that. We'll come to you, sir, at the back with your question, sir. You can go ahead with your question.
Okay, my name is Dennis Tembo. I'm a CIMA student. My view on consultants is that people tend to engage consultants with an open check, kind of, where they're not too sure what is it that they want to get from the consultants. Basically, the consultant walks in and then determines the terms of reference. And for me, I think that is a wrong perception of what a consultant should do. A consultant must be given a spec of what he needs to deliver. And after the consultant has been in the organization, there should be a skills transfer where from the owner of the organization needs to take over and carry on and not start relying on. And you find this a lot in the government sectors, where they rely on the consultants year in, year out.
Yeah.
For me, that is not value creation. Value creation is you bring in a consultant this year, he does whatever what needs to be done, and then you carry on from there.
Exactly. Thank you so much for your response there, Dennis. Anyone else with a question before we come back to our panel? If not, we'll let you simmer for a moment before we come back. But I do want us to pick up on that particular theme. Of course, naturally, there needs to be clear definition with regard to the objectives that consultants need to have in place. But John does raise a very critical topic and theme here with regard to skills, especially as we move into the digital age. You mentioned Control-C, Control-V. What does that also mean for the management accountants in the room who clearly have to broaden, shift, and change their thinking and strategy going forward with regard to how they deliver their services to their clients and the corporates that they lead? But also when it comes to the complexities of the fact that the talent pool in South Africa, even for the industry of management accountants and management accountancy in South Africa, is actually quite a small one. So where are we going to find all these creative thinkers that need to lead us into a prosperous future? Let's start with you, Adrian.
Thank you. I think part of the challenge is the fact that, this is partly my perception based on what my children are going through of education at the moment. It feels very much like a factory environment. You start at one end and you go through a straight process and you get to the end and you've got a matric certificate. I think, and I'm looking forward to hearing your response as well, we've got to be non-traditional going forward in terms of how we can provide access to skills. That doesn't mean that maths and science aren't important topics or subjects to focus on. But we've got to be able to do skills development in a non-traditional way, because it cannot be a 12-year process. Because if that's the case, we're going to have a few generations that we won't be able to address. So if we don't, and I don't know what the answer to that is, but I definitely believe it can't be a 12-year process that just follows the same route, and I'll defer to you on this one.
I also want to challenge you on that because of your entrepreneurial background. Certainly you had to align yourself with people who might have a similar vision, similar thinking to some of the dynamics that you had to implement. So that's a practical example that we could perhaps learn from?
Yeah, we often employed people who didn't have a background in the industry, and we'd actually effectively on-the-job training.
Why though?
But, because the skill is not readily available. So you had to teach people. And I think that's part of, in an entrepreneurial environment, it's easier to do because it's a small business. So you can bring people in and train and skill them up. And certainly in the corporate environment, we do have programs where we bring people in and skill them up. I think a lot of the corporates do. And I think that's a corporate responsibility in our country, because of the education levels that we have. And but the only challenge that I find is that, is it enough? It needs to be able to address more people in a larger population group.
Munashe, I know this is closely to your heart because you're trying to shake up the way education is being taught in South Africa, and of course identifying certain objectives in children when they're at quite a young age.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Basically, coming to what Adrian has said, we have designed an educational system basically from early childhood we believe that, you know, kids are different, and being different, each child should have a different focus, and a different attention should be given to a specific child that has to do with the inborn talents the child has. So basically what we argue is that education should not start from pre-primary school, but it should start from an assessment school. Because psychologists say a child from the age of 3, you can actually determine what talents that they have. So back then, Professor Harold Gardner from Harvard Business School did find out that there are about 11 types of intelligences. And we have very few people who might be multiple talented, you know, with all those, maybe 8 out of 11, 10 out of 11, or all 11, right? But you'd find out that nowadays, a child who is artistically inclined is chucked out of the school system, mainly because the child is artistic. So we have therefore come up with a system that would say, let's assess this child and let's nurture the child in the field that they are in. Not only will this assist the child, but it will also improve our economies. From an artistic side and, you know, from the sports side as well. You look at economies like the United States make more than $1.6 trillion annually from the arts industry alone. So we in Africa are not, you know, focusing on that. We're just focusing on corporate, and corporate. You see, or business, and business. But we can still take art to corporate. We can still take sports to corporate, you understand? So we need an educational system that will accommodate everybody.
Yeah. And as I joked yesterday, with the growth in these various industries that does increase, I mean, there's one particular stakeholder that will benefit quite nicely from that. Government with increased taxes, right?
Yes.
With artists making more money. But Tumelo, you also have an interesting view as to who you look to when it comes to increasing and improving your talent pool.
I believe in the man who has failed and gotten up, regardless of what profession you're sitting in. by no means, I trust professionals with everything that we have, and I believe that any business has to have a professional, either an accountant, a lawyer that can actually assist. But in my business, what I actually look for is people that have been able to go through and persist through the rough times. I would rather employ a guy who has had D's in his transcript, but was able to pass his degree. That to me shows that that guy has persistence and perseverance to go forth. And then that's the guy that I want to have, because I can work with that kind of person.
So teaching that person on the job, similar to some of the stories that Adrian also shared with us, whether from a corporate or entrepreneurial perspective. We do have about 5 minutes before we start wrapping up today's conversation. And for the individuals who are here in the room, many of them management accountants, and those who will be watching at home, also leaders within corporate industries, what I want us to take away here is, how do I take today's conversation and implement it into the business strategies that I hope to follow through with, especially as we move into a new year and a new strategic direction, despite the amount of noise we have in the market. For the average management accountant, they probably plagued with a lot of pressures with regard to trust and sustainability, but are working their way on to gaining that confidence back, despite what we might have seen in the news headlines just this year. But how do I take the outcomes of value creation? How do I ensure that I'm a key role player within the entity that I serve, to ensure that not only do I bring value as an individual, but that the institution that I'm under also creates value for all those stakeholders, and the trust is still there and implemented. Your closing remarks as we tie this in for the management accountants in the room to roll up their sleeves and implement this strategy. Adrian?
I think I'll end off on what I said earlier, is that value creation for me, I think, should be personal, where you look at your role that you have within the organization, within your community, within society, and actually from that perspective, actually see whether you're creating or preserving value, and how do you change what you do within those communities. And especially with something like technology, because technology as a change does create fear. And I think if you look at technology as an opportunity and actually take a long look at the value you create for the organization, and it can't be Control C, Control V. Everybody's more than that. And actually look at that and say, well, what value could I create if I wasn't doing Control C, Control V? And I think that would be my message, is look at your own value and use that to inspire your 2018.
Monashe?
Well, adding to what Adrian has said, indeed, you can create value anywhere in the community, but when focusing mostly in the workspace, I believe every person is an intrapreneur, which means you can be enterprising within the entity you are working in. Well, this will depend as well with the model that the employer also puts, you understand? Because there are, the employers or managers would not, open up to their subordinates to say you can be enterprising within the entity, which would make it difficult for the subordinate to be enterprising, because I might know something that my superior does not know, but if I do tell him or her, but if she cannot accommodate me, then it would be very difficult. So both to employers and employees, I would say, create an environment that is, a learning organization whereby even the employer or the superior may learn from the subordinate, and the subordinate also should be inquisitive to have ideas flowing, in and out of their minds.
Fantastic. Tumelo, you have the last word.
Thank you. Yeah, I think as a country, we're moving in a space where we need to have inclusive thinking in value. That as a country, we need to start looking at how do we move ourselves from where we are now. I think we are in a very tight spot going forth with the credit downgrading and so forth. So if value to us is inclusive from employer to employee, we see the same thing. Like I said to you yesterday, we need to start having a sense of responsible leadership from an employer perspective, but we also need to have a responsible employee who sees that my job and purpose in this company is to create value, not just to get a salary at the end of the month. That's, for me, very, very important. And if entrepreneurs, business, and government can start working together, because we need entrepreneurs to create jobs. And I think the market of corporate is so stifled that now entrepreneurs need to be the game changer to create more jobs and to make a much more sustainable economy.
Exactly. Well, a powerful note to leave it on, gentlemen, and thank you so much for giving us your views. But some of the themes that were certainly used today are equitable, trust, empowerment, as well as inclusive, and all of these do speak to some of the dynamics that we need to implement when it comes to our value creation strategies within the entities that we serve. For the management accountants, it certainly is going to be a slightly rough ride for the next couple of months, but one thing that we've certainly proven as South Africans is that we are resilient. So despite the noise that does come through, we are able to consistently not only identify, create, but also preserve value for our various stakeholders, regardless of the pressures that we might face. I'd like to thank my guests who have joined us and our panelists on stage, Adrian van der Merwe, partner at Financial Services Africa at EY, Munashe Mopa, who's the managing director at Naftali Consulting and Research Institute, and Tumelo Chaka, who's the executive director at Senate Capital. For CNBC Africa, I'm Kukule Tutsele.